Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to the Doomer
Right.
Optimism podcast. I'm here with Travis, Logan, and John Williams. A little bit of background on this episode, which is kind of interesting. So I've been putting on sort of happening into the circumstances of life, putting on these various events related to themes we talk about on this podcast. I had two different events in Wyoming, and then I just had a recent event in Margaretville, New York with Matt Crawford and Paul Kingsnorth. And at that event, I met Travis, who is super cool and very smart and like had been, circling around the Doomer Optimism sphere for a while, and I'm super glad we met. Was very impressed with a lot of his comments and talks at the retreat. And so we had been talking after the retreat, a bunch of people who attended that retreat, just about the various themes we brought up. And Travis brought up this piece by John Williams. And I was like, wow, this is such an amazing article. It's such a really cool set of ideas. So we thought we would just sort of dig into this piece you wrote, and talk about a lot of the themes because they all sort of align. So I'll start by having Travis introduce himself, then John, and then we can kind of get into the meat of the piece.
Thanks, Ashley. Hi. So my name is Travis Logan. I'm a high school English teacher, and I have a little Substack where I review often self-published novels online. But um, I found a piece by John called I think it's called. It's funny I don't remember the title. I think it's Techne-Zen and the art of. I'm sorry, in the spiritual quality of global capitalism. Is that the
Yep, I'm
title?
looking at it right now. Yep.
Right, yeah.
And but it's like chapter 7, I think, is I don't remember the number, but of a larger book related to kind of Zen Buddhism and technology and kind of art and technology. Which I'll admit I haven't read the entire thing, but this is about 2 years ago. I've read a number of the chapters, and to be perfectly, I'm going to put all my cards on the table here. I am honestly not used to finding high quality analysis within academic humanities, roughly. I mean, I'm just going to be perfectly frank about that. But nevertheless, I persist in reading, um, and I was like, frankly, almost like my hair blown back to actually find something worth my time for once. And it's stuck with me. I think I read it 2 years ago. And I'm busy. I'm like a father. I'm a high school teacher. I just have like I've got dogs and chickens and I've got a whole life. And so a lot of my reading is happening like in a classroom where I'm kind of telling people to be quiet and stop hitting each other and all these things. And
Right.
but still I'm kind of, I don't know, I'm still able to get through pretty dense stuff. And John's writing was, in general, just like the analytical like depth of it and ability to like remain on task and remain like, focused on what is actually important happening in the world right now. It's just a kind of like, wow, it almost like made me think of university. It's like this is kind of what is supposed to be happening here. And it's just, and so anyway, I read much of this book like 2 years ago. And it's funny, I still think of it probably once a month. And, I'm talking to these people and, it kind of organically kind of just comes up in my mind. And I reread, some of it before this podcast, and I'm just surprised by how relevant it remains. Like I've continued in those 2 years, I've continued reading on this subject. I've continued thinking about the subject and developing as a person. And it's not like I look back and like, oh, 2 years ago I was in a very different place in my own kind of personal development. Yet this analysis still feels as powerful as it did when I saw it then. And so anyway, John, I think has, a number of like important credentials and all these things, but I think the most important thing to introduce him, and he's of course going to do that himself, but is the power of the analysis is kind of what, in my view, what makes him special and important and worth listening to. And kind of with that, I've asked John to maybe introduce himself.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you, Travis. That was an extremely generous introduction. And obviously, as an academic author, you sometimes wonder if anyone's reading it at all, let alone appreciating it. So
Not the
that's
first time
really,
someone said that to me, by the way. Like, oh my God, someone read this?
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, no, they're not exactly like bestsellers, the types of books and articles that I write. So it's really rewarding to hear you say that. Um, and yeah, I've kept on this topic. That book was published in 2014.
Wow.
And yeah, so it's been around for some time now, and I just submitted a manuscript for a second book, which I'm calling Out of Mind, Media Theoretical Critique of Meditation. And it sort of picks up on some of the themes from the previous book, but focuses more specifically on the history of people that are spiritual but not religious in the West, and how meditation has played an important framing part of that spirituality since, at least the late 19th century. So that's been the sort of arc of my work since then. But I was really fascinated to hear people were reading, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and still talking about it. I think it's true that these are questions that are enduring and that are important to ask and think about.
Yep. And I'll just frame a little bit before we get started by saying a lot of the themes of this podcast and the event that we went to, the phrasing that we keep coming back to is Paul Kingsnorth uses this term, the machine.
Hmm.
And so it's kind of like, what are the aspects of the machine in our daily lives? How do we resist it? How do we think about it? And, how do we think about technology in a critical way? There was a whole there are just various discussions on the different ways technology forms in our lives and what to do about it. There's a whole subcontingent of people who are like sort of turning to religion, like, Christianity, as a way to sort of feel connected to something more, eternal, and get a moral guidance. So anyways, this is kind of like the overall arching theme is, Paul Kingsnorth is more on the, let's go into a cave, let's get away from all technology. I don't use a phone. I hate the internal combustion engine. And Matt Crawford is like, cars are cool and you should use technology in a certain way that enhances human life, and it's okay to like navigate this middle zone. So anyways, just to kind of frame the conversation, these are the suite of questions we were asking at this event. And with that, I'll just pass it on to Travis to kind of get us started.
Thanks, Ashley. And so that I think the context there is important. Like this audience and kind of who I am the audience, by the way, is like, like I have a big garden and I have chickens and people are, but I'm kind of suburban. There are more people like homesteading, homeschool.
Small farmers, regenerative farmers. Yeah.
Yeah, and so Ashley ran a regenerative. I should let you explain it, but she lived in Uruguay for like 7 years. That's when I first learned about her program, kind of teaching, I think,
Yeah,
regenerative.
basically just an exchange program bringing American students to see small scale regenerative farming in Uruguay and South America. So just a lot of this sort of like, what is the embodied answer to the problem of technology, alienation, the meaning crisis, like all of those things. So there's lots of answers to that question, but one big part of it is sort of like more, appropriate technology, agriculture sort of thing. But
So and I think and that's what was so stunning to me about John's work is this idea of the Techne-Zen is kind of what we mean when we're talking about like how do we relate to quote unquote the machine. Um, and anyway, with that, like I kind of want to go. I'm interested in this like guy who I don't really like, John. Like not to alienate you, but like I don't really think he's kind of in our camp as much. But he's completely kind of cut straight to the heart of the matter. Although I don't really know what your background is or kind of like where you are. But maybe you do live out on a homestead somewhere, but not. I think
Wow.
probably not.
No, I live in New York City for the most part,
Yeah, exactly.
so very far from any homesteading. I mean, I also have a small apartment in New Haven where I stay when I'm teaching here.
mm,
I'm on campus now today.
mm,
Um, but yeah, no, in terms of my own background spiritually, I was raised as a fairly Orthodox Mormon in Salt Lake City, Utah. Left that church in my mid 20s and then have since then kind of just been fascinated by the study of religion. I think sort of being sort of indoctrinated and having that deeply religious background, and thinking about it philosophically has sort of stayed with me. So I
Mm,
would say religious studies is one of the realms that I continue to think a lot about, partly
mm,
because of that background. Yeah.
mm.
You correct me if I'm wrong. You may be at NYU, I think, doing something with film, but also something with like religious, right? It's like film and religion or something. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, so I have a visiting scholar appointment at NYU in the Center for Religion and Media.
Oh,
Um,
weird. Interesting.
it's an interesting center. A lot of my work recently has shifted more toward questions of media studies, the philosophy of like the medium and communication studies, which are, of course, a natural extension of technological concerns as
Mm,
well.
hmm
But it's just been I guess, taught a graduate class there on religion and media. And it's just been a nice, like, little home away from home to, workshop ideas and things. So,
Perfect. So, Travis, do you want to jump into
Yeah, I
the
do. Yeah,
first
sorry.
question?
Yeah, I
I
can
think
turn
it'll
them
be
over.
great. I think it'll be
Yeah.
perfect for
So
this.
I think this is from chapter one of your book, but there's this, I'm just going to read my own writing here. So it says, um, there's this, so I've got a short quote, just a fragment of a sentence that I'd like you to describe in detail. It is, quote, the mechanical enframings of the Anglo-American disenchantment of nature. And so there's two kind of sections here I'm interested in hearing you talk about. One, in the book, you do talk about these kind of framings. I think it's related to the Hockney study of that kind of like the change that happened in drawing and the right. But maybe you should talk more about that.
Mm,
And like, yeah, basically this mechanical enframings. Kind of what do you mean by that?
mm. And
oh,
yeah, and if it's an Anglo-American phenomenon, this is
Yeah,
actually something we talked a little bit about at the Margaretville event. I'd be curious
that's
to
the
hear.
second question.
Yeah.
sure, yeah. Well, it's a traditional take on the Enlightenment is that it basically encompassed a disenchantment of nature, that philosophies that were animistic or cosmological in a kind of holistic sense no longer applied. The universe worked like a clock. It was very mechanical. And a number of philosophers have seen that as an extension of basically early Christology, where because Jesus was the only begotten Son of the Father, that meant that he was created in a way that was different than everything else that was begotten. Or
Mm,
unbegotten, right? So that meant that the universe was itself a kind of mechanical clock. Jesus had this sort of very special status as something that existed outside of time. And then you get people like Immanuel Kant who update that to the sense of the soul as also existing in this kind of eternal realm that is non-mechanical and that is holistic and organic. And so there's always been this anxiety about what we might call is just externalism, the externalist condition of the human experience, that we're in some ways wholly reliant on the kinds of technologies that allow us to thrive and to flourish. And so often I noticed in the first book that whenever there was this deep anxiety about the machine and the sort of encroachments of industry and mechanism in modern life, at least since the 1890s, people in America and in parts of Europe turned to Asia and Asian religion and philosophy as a kind of antidote to that thinking, to that danger of, the over technologization of our experience. So when I say that that they thought of it as an antidote, that is also to sort of position it as a different response than the kind of Luddite anti, machine. It was not a way of saying we're going to follow the East away from our machines, but rather we're going to think of the East in terms of a kind of civilizational alterity that has machines, but they live with them in ways that are ecologically sound and that
mm,
are philosophically rewarding and are not alienating the way that our sort of machine culture has become in the West. So the thesis of the book became just to sort of examine historically how that idea emerged and how it developed, how, something that was already circulating in the 1890s becomes essentially a part of the Silicon Valley ethos of
Mm.
turning to Buddhism and spirituality as a way of softening the edges of what would otherwise be seem to be a kind of over encroachment of machine culture. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm thinking here. So yeah, that's all very helpful. That is wonderful. I'm thinking about you're talking about there was this almost like Turing test, I think you call it. In where do you remember this part in your book where David Hockney has done some kind of study where it
Mhm.
says he submitted the entire history of Western art to a kind of aesthetic Turing test, and according to his analysis, a surprising number of old masters tested positive for cyborgism.
Right.
What
And
does
so
that mean?
yeah, and so what it means is like they'd been using like some means of basically like non-human kind of non-organic means of improving their own art. And I think the point here was like it doesn't like if you go really far back, there's like already kind of mechanical, inorganic, um, aid to human beings, even in periods when we think of like pre-industrial revolution, certainly, pre-internet, that there already is this melding of man
Mm.
and machine. Do you get
Yeah.
what I'm saying?
Yeah, and for Hawking, that's the sort of like primal, original sin of the West in art was that they embraced perspectival depth, portrayals, and they were using in his, formulation different kinds of lenses and
Exactly. That makes
chemioteras
sense.
and things that would allow them to project not just to sort of see perspectively, but to sort of render light and dark in the way that we would think of as a kind of photographic rendering. He was seeing this all the way back in the late Middle Ages and Van Eyck and so on. Um, and he thinks of that as a kind of, I think he sort of calls it a bad theology because the perspectival notion that when you look at a canvas, you're seeing through a window onto a scene, sort of renders the horizon as a kind of ever receding possibility that
Mm.
is, the sort of endless, God out there that's never reached in some ways. And he contrasts that with the history of Asian arts, and he looks specifically at a Chinese scroll of the emperor in the 17th century, traveling down the river. And he notices that the people are all sort of jutting up against the surface, that there isn't this kind of receding depth perception that we would otherwise notice in a Canaletto or some other, Italian perspectival rendering. So for Hockney, he sort of sees this as like this was an original way of thinking about one's relationship to the world that
Mm.
was still engaged in a kind of technical craftsmanship in art, but it didn't sort of give in to the mechanical entrapments of the machine. And he then takes that and updates it with a series of innovations in art that I think he would portray as wholly consistent with that Asian aesthetic. So his Polaroid, collages where he's basically showing a single uh, place, but from multiple different perspectives in Polaroid shots, and they all kind of push up against the frame in a very similar way. So and that's I think that's one of my arguments is that this idea that Asia stands in for the techne, which is not the tech less, like it's not to say
I
that they don't
know.
have
Yeah, we're gonna get to
technology, but then the techno and the techno would be like over inframed by the machine. The techne is this kind of like living with the machine that's
Mm.
healthier and that's more rewarding and allows human beings to flourish into their sort of original technological condition.
And
Mm.
for like kind of Ashley's audience here, like interestingly at our meeting, whatever 2 weeks ago or something, there was this almost like split. There was down the middle between Paul Kingsnorth, who is a British kind of, writer and, kind of, frankly, romantic, kind of Eastern Orthodox convert who doesn't own a cell phone and kind of lives, he writes about the quote unquote wild saints. It's a wonderful product. I mean, I love it. He's one of my favorite writers, but, he is this kind of more romantic kind of anti-machine. That is his career is kind of founded on this idea of resisting the machine in a kind of reasonable way. And on the other side was, as Matt Crawford, who is more of the Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance, and he represented what we found is a number of us were Catholic, and a number of us were Eastern Orthodox, and the split was between the Orthodox and the Catholic. And yeah, it's true. I mean, it's like and they have different approaches to technology, and the Orthodox one, at least as far as we can tell, is a bit more anti. But which struck me 2 years ago when I read your thing about this kind of kind of west going east to find an alternative. But anyway, so as Ashley was kind of emphasized, what can you say about kind of the Anglo-American element here, presumably related to kind of Adam Smith and Industrial Revolution and kind of capitalism? But what are your thoughts on the Anglo-American character of disenchantment?
Well, I think obviously the notion of disenchantment's probably always been historically an over-exaggerated condition. I don't think we've ever really, there is no like philosopher who's completely disengaged from
where that term comes from?
Well, there's a book by Horkheimer and Adorno called The Dialectic of Enlightenment.
I think it's actually Weber before them.
Oh, right. Well, they're picking up on Weber. I think the Adorno and Horkheimer are the sort of the quintessential articulation of this thesis that basically, and it's a really provocative idea because they basically argue that mechanical disenchantment is what leads to, the Holocaust, essentially, that the Nazis have sort of fully embraced the machine. And so they are very much, kind of addressing that under the most extreme conditions. But I forget where we were, what the
Anglo-American kind of character.
Oh, right. Yeah, so I think one of the things I was trying to respond to in the book as well was this idea that was posited by a scholar named Edward Said in the mid-1970s called Orientalism.
Yeah.
The notion of Orientalism is that the West has, for centuries, millennia, systematically otherized the East, right? Portrayed the East as lesser, as non-mechanical, as not logical, as erotic rather than passionless and philosophical. And so there's this, and to a degree, that's very true, right? There is this kind of East-West stereotyping that happens.
Have you ever read The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann?
Yes.
Huge in that
Very, very much so, right? And Said's examples are legion, and it's a really compelling book. I mean, he slightly revises it in the 90s with another book more specifically on British imperialism. But what I noticed was that the Anglo-Americans who were invested in this particular idea of Asia were not otherizing it in a way that was alienating and disparaging and prejudicial, but almost as a way of like celebrating it. They were, instead of seeing the other in the other, they were kind of projecting the self into the other. And there was this romanticization of Asian civilization and culture and religion and art. And so I was sort of interested in this entire tradition as a kind of complication to the very idea that there was this wholly disenchanted notion of
Wait, hold on. Just specify this tradition as a complication. What does this stand for there?
So this tradition, meaning the Asia as a kind
okay,
of
thank you. Okay,
right. That whole sort of line of thought and all of the different cultural texts and ideas, films, and so on that emerge from that, including Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, are a complication of that notion that the West is a disenchantment, wholly and without exception and reservation. I found it to be much more complicated once you get into this particular form of Orientalism.
And I just want to make one clarifying point before we keep going, because your questions, the more I look at them, Travis, the more perfect they like. It follows a great progression, but we could just stick with those. But Can you just talk briefly about Luddism then? Where does this fit in this whole universe, and how is it different from Techne?
Well, it sounds like a half of your attendees at the conference may have been Luddite to some
Yeah,
extent, which is
yeah.
just to say, sort of very, very suspicious of not only technology, but the kind of philosophical metaphysics that lead to technology, the kind of investment in rationality and mathematics and measurement and thinking of the world as kind of operating according to mechanical conditions, that nature itself is a kind of vast clock that's turning according to certain rules. So to be sort of truly Luddite is, I mean, the term was originally a kind of political
Yeah.
effort to, basically destroy the machines that were taking work away from laborers in
Mhm.
factories and so on. But it's become a more sort of larger catch-all phrase for those that espouse a kind of, new communalism, a kind of back to the land, don't use your cell phone. I see it in people that do like digital fasts and are
Mm.
trying in every, all of these different ways of getting away from the machine and what it stands for in our culture.
Mhm.
And then can you contrast and compare that with both techno, as you alluded to earlier, and then techne as kind of your central thing in your book?
Right. Well, so specifically with regard to Asia, those terms are important because there is, of course, the case of Japan, who, at least since the early 20th century, was adopting very intensely American and Western machine culture, military culture, transportation, communication technologies. And there was this fear that Japan was rising up and becoming a world power precisely because of its investment in modern technologies. And if you go back and read like old sort of Yellow Peril novels or Yellow Peril reportage like Jack London's, you see that there was this real fear that Japan would technologize China and that China was this sleeping giant that would wake up and I guess in some ways it's become true, but would sort of dominate the world technologically. So that was the sort of the fear of the techno, of the sort of the Asia as having um, not just the sort of barbarian hordes without civilization, but that they are in fact I think one scholar called it a mimetic industrial complex, that they're copying the West's technological sophistication and using it to rise up. And so that was sort of in contrast to this idea of techne, which is a term, if you go back and you look at the original Greek, the term techne, which is where we get technology, originally meant both art and device, right? Crafts and different forms of creating that were not just contrivances, mechanical or otherwise. It could include knitting or creating a pot or all kinds of crafts. And so I use that as a way of saying every time this this romantic vision of Asia emerges, it's often they use this word techne, that there's a kind of techne that we can recover from the tradition that we've lost in the West. We've lost this holistic, beautiful way of living with the machines, and the Asian, culture somehow never got it wrong or got it right in some capacity.
Mm.
Have you
Wait, Travis, I just want to make one comment. I don't know if either of you have ever read this, but one of my favorite authors is Morris Berman. He wrote like a book about disenchantment as well, and he wrote this book, Neurotic Beauty: An Outsider Looks at Japan. And the basic thesis of it is leading up to the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, potential role of Japanese philosophy in creating, I'm reading the description, dynamic approach to human nature and our understanding of reality, and basically focuses on Japan's vibrant craft tradition and argues that Japan could be the front runner of developing post-capitalist alternatives in the 21st century, and that like the US is too locked in and there's no way to like develop a cultural alternative that's as vibrant in the US. So that's like basically I think the question of the rest of this conversation is
Yeah.
like, is there
Yeah,
a
I find that's exactly in line with the tradition that we've been describing.
yeah.
That's essentially the thesis. Is I noticed that this is not this is
So
not
you
a
should read that book. You would like it, I
no.
think.
It sounds like it would be exactly
Well, I've
affirming.
got a question for you, John.
Yeah.
To what extent is this is not from my planned questions, but to what extent is your view, like, all right, so multi-pronged question. One, to what extent is your book, when we're talking about kind of updating Orientalism, or at least like, kind of further finding an instantiation of Orientalism,
Mhm.
and roughly that has a negative charge to it. And so, if so, to what extent is a book like this kind of engaging in simple, basically racism, and not, not a more like kind of, perspective on the world that's like, well, we need to kind of look at competitor ideologies, in a way that really isn't oriented towards race, but is like almost civilizational and future oriented.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a good question. I think to me, the question of whether or not it's racist, I'm not particularly invested in that. Obviously, like stereotypes abound when one begins to talk about East and West. And so just the very category that there is an East is like, whoa, how many, 2.5 billion people, or how many people are we talking
Right.
about when we say
Yeah.
East? There's all kinds of complexity and nuances that get reduced and flattened in these caricatures of culture. So obviously, yes, race obviously becomes an important part of the discourse. I think for me, the critique that I'm more interested in making is the way in which this proposed solution that Asian culture has this special kind of antidote to the over-technologization of our own culture is sort of subscribing in some ways to a fantasy
Yeah.
that I think in some ways prevents us from seeing what we really actually need to do to change what's happening in the world. I think um, it underestimates the disenchantment of culture in the East as well.
Right.
Are
Absolutely.
extremely powerful capitalist forces and machines working in Asia every bit as
Like,
much.
frankly, not no offense. I lived in Asia,
Yeah.
in Vietnam and Hanoi. It's, the people are wonderful, but it's tough to, with the pollution and the traffic, and there's nothing like it in the West, really.
Yeah, and so to that extent, when people describe this discourse, they often adhere to what this French anthropologist Johannes Fabian called the denial of coevalness, which is the denial of existing at the same time, that the Asia that they celebrate is always the ancient
Yeah, yeah.
Asia,
Mm.
that
Romantic,
the romantic ideal of this other that
nostalgic, almost in a weird way.
exactly, yeah. Yeah. So yeah, the critique I'm trying to engage in is more of a sort of like, what do we think this discourse is doing with this idea that Asia has the answer for us?
Oh, and by the way, again, like one of the most powerful, I think, yeah. So as you've described is how I kind of interpreted it. And in that light, it's truly, in my view, one of the most powerful critiques. It is like, it's such a foolish thing, no offense to kind of, Western Buddhists and things. And it's, I respect the tradition, but there is a lot of woo there, and it
Yeah.
can be frankly foolish, and this book is like just decimate. It's worse than decimates, I think.
Mm.
Well, I hope that, I mean, I think you'll probably be my ideal reader for this second volume as well. I
I,
mean, I can tell you that the second book here I was a participant in a sort of endeavor at the Institute for Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, California.
I saw you do a talk there on like insulin, I think, right?
Yes, yes, on
I saw
Esalen.
you a long time ago.
This was a collective of scholars and journalists, public, personas, people that were meditators and so on, as well as some people that we referred to as technologists, which were basically sort of visitors from Silicon Valley who had come to speak with us. And the theme of the project was public technologies of theology and presence. And we were, assigned to basically, as a group, think about what forms of presence were emerging in the conditions of, vast digitalization of our lives and so on. And that first meeting, something happened that really struck me, which was we were going around the room and introducing ourselves at this conference table. And as we're going around, we're sort of seeing each other and sizing each other up and trying to understand where we're each coming from. And we got down to the end of the table, and there was a man who was a scholar of Buddhism. And he said, before I introduce myself, one thing I like to do in my classes and something I want to do here, which is I'm going to ask us all to set aside our laptops and our notebooks and have a moment of presence. I'm going to set my phone here. I'm going to time it for a minute, and we're just going to, breathe and have this moment of presence. And, and I've been in situations like this before where people ask you to sort of have a quick meditation or something, mainly because I study this, but I also know it's a pretty widespread practice now
Yeah.
in business and in classrooms and so on. And so, what I noticed was, we all set aside our laptops, our notebooks, and then I just kind of looked around the room and noticed that everyone sort of assumed this posture that they knew to assume, which was a sort of like straight back, eyes closed, head slightly bowed, some deep
Focus on the breath.
breathing. Yeah, the focus on the breath. And and then we just sort of endured this minute together, uh, or apart. I don't know. Like
Forward.
it's fascinating because as the more I thought about it, the more it came down to when it came around to me, I was like, I'm actually fascinated by first the fact that we all knew exactly what to do when
Mm.
he said, "Let's have a moment of presence," and that number two, that it involved setting aside these exterior encroachments like laptops, and because I had been thinking of, the notes I was taking and my laptop and the things as a way that sort of tethered me to the environment, that kept me engaged and present, if you
Yeah,
will,
yeah.
with what was happening. So I basically asked the question, like, in why do we call that a moment of presence? Why is that not a moment of absence where we're all sort of checking out or going inward in this kind of detached way from we're not looking at the clock, we're just sort of in ourselves in this moment, and yet that constituted definitionally the notion of presence. And so I began to think about that, like, what is it that we assume goes on inside us? And is it something that happens inside us when we meditate like that, when we think about our souls or ourselves as kind of recharging or somehow uh, repairing or therapeutically recovering from some other form of engagement with the world? And
Mm.
this sort of led me down a sort of deeper, longer path of sort of trying to locate the philosophy underlying that, that I would just call kind of like philosophical internalism, which is that there is this soul that's inside that is not exactly the body. It's not the world for sure. It's something that exists in a kind of wholly volitional, true interiority.
Is it
And
like
that
quietism?
well, yeah, I mean, yeah, and quietism is the sort of like one of the political effects of that, right? That there is uh, different before I say that, let me just say that the interiority that's supposedly cultivated in this space is a kind of the sort of pure subjectivity of Descartes. And I thought, oh, that's fascinating that this is like Enlightenment philosophy, but it's being portrayed as this Buddhist ontology.
I have a question I have to ask right
Go
now.
ahead, yeah.
Okay, so this is what I'm thinking as you're talking about this is like, I'd love to hear you talk through like your sense of the 60s counterculture through Silicon Valley through today with this like, dabbling in Eastern philosophy, but the more you talk about the like actual practicalities of how this is playing out, it sounds like there's this like kind of hyper bifurcation where there's like the show Silicon Valley and they show people doing this, these
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
these guys like go off into the woods and look,
Right.
I'm throwing it all away, but then like they're also like running the company, from their
Yeah.
phones, like when they're in their phone. And I feel like there's almost like this compartmentalization where they think now I'm doing a Buddhism and now I'm doing, and that like kind of clears my soul to then go hyper tech.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like it's almost like you can justify the one because you have the other. You're like, I'm sort of purifying my soul, and then I'm going to go hyper into the world with like no critical thinking at all about any of it. I just don't understand how to square like the Zen Eastern thing and the in
Western.
Silicon Valley, like the most tech like AI guys. What is going on in their heads? Is that what you think is happening? The sort of like compartmentalization of the worldview?
Yeah, I think that's really smart. I think essentially what they're embracing is what, a historian of meditation would probably describe as a privatization of emotional well-being. It's part of the whole neoliberal endeavor that
Mm.
you are a deep interior self that needs to be, that can be perfected, that can be improved, that can be cultivated, and that's how you get ahead in the world, not by like having, good healthcare or whatever. Like it's this deep interior self that must be perfected in order. And in fact, it becomes in Silicon Valley, that becomes the ideological basis for what they talk about when they say changing the world, which is you first perfect the self inside, and then that naturally flows into the kinds of products and systems and networks and possibilities that will, save us all.
To
Mm.
be fair, I actually, not that I'm defending Silicon Valley like, whatsoever, but just to be fair to them, I actually think it's, I read a Jack Dorsey thing one time where he's talking about every day in the morning takes like a super cold shower. And, it sounds dumb and it sounds like it's like related to this kind of juice drinking, sandal wearing kind of lifestyle. But he said it was actually like, I hate this so much that forcing myself into this freezing water he's like, I have to go and make these impossible decisions like every day.
Yeah.
And I find that if I force myself into the cold shower in the morning, I'm better able to deal with these enormous like decisions that are affecting so many people. And so,
Wow.
just, like again, I'm not really defending these guys, but I don't know how dumb they are. You know what I mean? I think that they're working something out too. I think.
Mm.
Oh, for sure. I mean, all of the, as I say, technologists that I met from Silicon Valley are extremely intelligent, extremely bright. That particular example I find really interesting because in some ways that's not it's different than a detachment from the world, right? He's actually sort of like bracing himself into the world.
Embodiment.
Well, I
Yeah.
think what
Yeah,
they're trying to do is find like almost like I want to say quite commodified, but they want like spiritual. It's almost like what LSD, and you want spirituality enlightenment like on demand. And so they want these little hacks that you can use the biology or the psychology of any person to just like achieve these states that get you into a flow or get you into these kind of useful for the machine states.
Mm.
And like, Adderall, let's say, just taking amphetamine works for a lot of people, but it's like it's like, at some point there's problems with it. It creates problems in your life. And that's like, I'd rather do this without some brute amphetamine. You know what I
Mm.
mean?
right.
But it's almost like enchantment in service of the machine.
Exactly right. That's exactly what I think it
Yeah. No, that's right. That
is.
I think
Let me
that I
get let
mean,
me get enchanted real quick. Let me get embodied,
Well, it's
know.
actually remember Paul was talking about the Ian McGilchrist concept. So I don't know if you've heard of Ian McGilchrist, John. He's this
yeah,
psychologist. I haven't read his book, but he's got this, thesis that you have like I don't know if it's like the spirit or whatever side of the brain that's more kind of qualitative.
Oops. Sorry,
Yeah,
I'm okay.
you're okay. And the quantitative side, and it should be that the quantitative side serves the qualitative side, but instead we've got it all reversed.
Mm.
And this is a kind of example of this using that interiority and that internal quality
mhm,
to serve, whatever your kind of the ma that what in your book you talk about measurement as ma,
yeah.
that kind of other side, the classic side.
I think that the sort of the pinnacle, the zenith of this particular way of thinking is the notion that surprised me how many people I met in Silicon Valley uh, who subscribe to this, but like the true belief that at some point we're going to reach a point where we can upload our
Yeah,
consciousnesses to the machine
worthwhile.
and and so that's sort of that condition of this kind of like inner neurological patterning that is just sort of ones and zeros. um, I think that's the ultimate sense of like the perfectible interior self that can even, exist forever. We can achieve immortality through the
We
machine.
we
So
had a guy. speak at our conference who was reading a book by have you ever David Hart Bentley Hart, I think his name is. Have you ever heard of him?
Mhm.
I don't know him.
Like an Anglican kind of, he's a left wing Anglican, theologist, I guess.
Hmm.
And his recent book is on artificial intelligence, and his thesis, roughly, according to this guy, Charles, what was his name?
Charles Carman.
Carmen, that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
His little speech was on this guy saying part of the project of AI is this kind of materialist and naturalist kind of concept popular among technologists that we can just produce intelligence artificially. There's nothing to it. There's nothing here. There's no depth here,
Yeah.
which is an interesting thesis.
Yeah,
Um,
you're a computer yourself, basically.
Exactly.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that's the point of the AI project.
Travis, I think it would be a good point. I'm curious, at least, to get John's take on question 4. And
Yeah.
part of this, okay, we're talking about this one extreme, which is like the Silicon Valley technologists and how they're basically how they're managing this, like hyper disenchantment, hyper, like uploading all of life into the machine and how they're like figuring it out and integrating it. Our subgroup is not that at all. But we are kind of split between us, like I would say most people aren't going towards Buddhism, but instead like kind of looking back into our own, lineages and find what kind of like, ways to be re-enchanted in the world exist and guidance for how to manage a technological modern world. Half of the people, like we said, are like Orthodox, and half are like Christian or Protestant, or Catholic or Protestant. It's interesting, and maybe we could just like talk about. I don't want to like psychologize Paul Kingsnorth too much, but like he went from basically like an anti-globalization leftist climate change activist to like a Wiccan and now Eastern Orthodox Christian. And maybe Travis, you could read this
Yeah.
quote
The other
real
thing,
quick.
but the real thing that's important here is that like there's been like almost a left to right migration. Like I'm much more of a right coded person. Like I'm a veteran, and I'm like I'm like a church going Catholic, and Paul Kingsnorth, it was left coded. Now he was kind of anti-vax, and like I don't think he can't vote, but like he's not like a vocal Trump supporter, but like he's
But critical of the COVID regime in the sense that
yeah.
it was like a technologically advanced, like authoritarian top-down thing.
Yeah. And so there's like, so I'm trying to get your take on the kind of migration, the political migration of this kind of romantic ideology. So anyway, here's this line. Can I read a short paragraph?
Yeah.
So, in the kingdom of man, this is whatever. Okay, in the kingdom of
Like
man,
this is Kingsnorth's words.
yeah. In the kingdom of man, the seas are ribboned with plastic, the forests are burning, the cities bulge with billionaires and tented camps, and still we kneel before the idol of the great god economy as it grows and grows like a cancer cell. And what if this ancient faith is not an obstacle after all, but a way through? As we see the consequences of eating the forbidden fruit, of choosing power over humility, separation over communion, the stakes become clearer each day. Surrender or rebellion, sacrifice or conquest, death of the self or triumph of the will, the cross or the machine. We have always been offered the same choice. The gate is straight and the way is narrow, and maybe we will always fail to walk it, but is there any other road that leads us home?
Mm.
And so his call is kind of like, what if a kind of traditional Christianity is the antidote to the machine, the kind of globalized tech kind of macro culture? And what I'm trying to get from you is this is different than a kind of left coded, kind of almost Manson family ish, maybe not as extreme, but kind of moving out of the city, maybe taking LSD, et cetera. What do you make of that political migration of this orientation?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating quotation. I feel like I should read the entire book that it's from.
It's just
Uh,
an article.
Yeah,
yeah,
the article is across in the
an
machine. Yeah, it
article.
was like
Okay.
kind of Kingsnorth's big watershed, like coming out as a Eastern Orthodox article a couple years ago.
Yeah, I mean, well, in the simplest of terms, you could say that his this sort of biographical movement that he's made from protesting the systemic infrastructures that are creating suffering and climate change toward this much smaller, I guess in some ways, spiritual investment in Eastern Orthodox theology is very much a transition from an investment in externalism to internalism, right? He's
Mm,
moving toward the idea that the real way
Right.
to solve the systemic problems of the world is by
Personal power.
refining the soul,
mm.
Yeah.
right? And that, in the end, I find is the sort of that's the sort of temptation since the since the dawn of time
Yeah.
to think of the subjective internal self as the thing that is driving what's in the world.
So you think it's more we need like more of a solidarity approach and a kind of, more like externalist.
Engagement with the material world.
Yeah,
And
right. So I mean, in not all senses, but in many senses, I would say that I'm a Heideggerian at this point. Heidegger's the basic phenomenological premise is that we are beings in the world,
mm,
right? That it's wrong to think of the subjective self as like this isolatable
Mhm.
entity.
Mhm.
That we are from the beginning relational beings. That human
mm.
beings from the very beginning have been relational, not just with their environments, with the tools, with the
Paul
most
wouldn't disagree with this.
well, right. But I think in some ways
But
to
But I would say
suggest
this
though,
argument, like this is actually kind of the crux of the argument that Crawford and Kingsnorth were having at the end, which is sort of like, um, I remember Kingsnorth was saying something about, we just need to spend, like, more of us need to go retreat into caves and blah, blah, blah. And then Matt was like, do you even love the world? And actually, Matt Crawford told this story. Maybe I shouldn't repeat it. Maybe it
no,
was
I'm
kind of
fascinated. Yeah.
private. Well, he just told this story about how I won't tell all of it, but one portion of it was he's riding on his motorcycle with his new wife, and she had mentioned before he told this story, like you have even like praised and said that you love the workers who laid the asphalt on this road because it's like a work of art that you made
84
this.
in the Santa Cruz Mountains, if you've ever been up there at
Okay.
altitude.
Yeah, and then he was saying, they're riding their bike together, whatever, and they fall off the bike and nobody's hurt, but Matt's like, I have this moment where I see Marilyn's boot and the little metal on the boot is going across the ground and the little sparks are flying off of it, and it was just like this moment of bliss, and I was like, that is a guy who's in the world and just it, like there is technology, there's this sort of like
Yeah.
negative alienating force of like a car and a road, but then also like he's embodied using that technology in that way, and kind
He's
of
not
like,
looking for meditative, like lock myself in a monk's room and pray
Yeah.
about it.
yeah, so
Well,
this is a tension.
the other technique that I write a whole chapter on is the invention of the sensory isolation tank, which
Nice.
I did myself as
Really
well.
great.
Like this sort of like isolate yourself in this floating water, or it's like water that's been filled with Epsom salts, and you get in this tank and you can kind of it's completely dark and soundless, and you're floating, so you don't feel any gravity. And that's the sort of like the ideal of like wholly arriving at the internal self. I mean, I think to the degree that Kingsnorth will agree that we are relational beings, that we exist with our environments and with the other people where we're at, I think that occasional efforts to, draw attention to the infrastructural conditions of our being, like, that's great, like that's important because that's one way of, to my
Challenge
mind,
either.
recognizing the need to take control of these infrastructural conditions and have technological experiences that help us flourish as human beings, as
Mm,
opposed to, I think that the problem is that the impulse toward the cave, toward the
Yeah,
retreat,
yeah.
toward toward the inside is a retreat that I think is ultimately a kind of cruel optimism. It's something that you're doing that you think is going to solve the problem, but
mm,
it's taking you further away from the original human condition, which is to be relational, which is to be
mm.
world.
Do you
Wait,
think that,
okay.
you go, Ashley.
I was going to say, first of all, we should probably do a follow-on episode where we get Paul to come on and defend
Cool.
himself
I would
and
love
have
that.
John
I
there
would love
too,
that.
and we could talk about it. I also just want to bring this up because another episode, another person who reached out to me is this guy named Casey Spinks. We had an episode like I don't know, maybe 6 episodes ago, about basically philosophy and this question. And it's a little bit long, but he sent me this like sort of comment in an email, and it's been rolling around in my head ever since. And it kind of integrates these two things. And part of it is he's critiquing. So we've got the Silicon Valley guys on one end, like sort of muscling the world into a certain like hyper tech future. Then you've got like the online right, who's kind of like in this weird will to power arc.
Yes.
And he was like, there's a way to, and then there's us, which is like, sort of Luddites critique of technology, whatever. So, okay, so I'm going to read this real quick and get your take. If we want to move this far into the weeds, I can do some intros of Heidegger, Jung, Schmidt, and how they're often portrayed by the online right. How I've been thinking about these guys in my writing for Front Porch Republic. The online right is reading Heidegger, Jung, and Schmidt at their most belligerent during the 1930s, and they're not paying attention to their later work. Especially Heidegger and Jung are turned away from a very Nietzschean will-to-power metaphysics of action to a contemplative sense of the German Gelassenheit, letting be, or letting the world be for itself, not comprehended by totalizing human projects. This shift also coincided with a renewed appreciation for the Christian faith and a return to German agrarianism. Heidegger requested a Catholic burial, and Jung joined the church at 101 and was buried as a Christian. Both spent the later half of their lives in the farm country, away from the press or larger culture. In short, the dissident right is liking Heidegger and Jung for their will to power orientation, but the real track they should be following, if they want to follow them, is toward agrarianism, contemplation, and faith. Now he says, I don't think this shift in orientation means, sort of letting the world go to hell. Instead, letting be is an important basis for all future action. We have to be contemplative even as we try to change the world for the better, because part of why the world is in such bad shape is the fact that humans have taken technocratic control, right down to eco-modernist policies of climate control. It's a tough paradox, last sentence, to change the world away from thinking that we have to change it and perfect it. But I think that's the lesson that the life trajectory of this thinkers has the most to teach us. It's kind of like there's not a really clear answer here, except that you have to be in between these two poles, and the contemplation that exists in the Western tradition can inform like how to move forward with technology. That's basically where I'm at.
Well, I'd be interested to hear. I think that what John is saying is like, yeah, like it's all I think this is a classic critique. That there's something almost like aristocratic and aloof about wanting to be out on your kind of country estate while like the kind of cities in the 1840s or whatever burn, and you can kind of like remain whatever, the workers, who cares, the peasants, who cares. And
yeah.
I am interested in, but like, even though I kind of like have that, even though I'm kind of like, whatever's going on there is really not what I'm interested in. But I am interested to hear, I am interested in having people challenge me and us on this. So I'm interested in John's feedback on, in a contemporary sense, if you do feel like, let's say you're a good person, but you are, I think with a lot of us, it's that if you're just an animal and you're bombarded by advertisements and just images of consumption and all of this crap, and it feels like you can't even think straight, and it's not about like achieving some perfect spiritual placidity and perfection. It's about like I can't even fucking think straight with this phone and with all this stuff. I have to get it away from me so I can read, and clearly that is exactly how I am. How does, if you can't like walk away into a cave, let's say, even though I kind of polarize against King's North within our little polls, but like I came to King's North many 10 years ago or something because of my feeling about this. What, not that I'm asking you to solve this impossible problem. I'm just wondering what the alternative perspective is on, being able to focus, and while with all this stuff going on around you.
Okay, yeah, those both fantastic comments. I don't know. I'll answer both. I'll try to answer both questions with one particular take on Heidegger, which it's interesting that your interlocutor has noticed that yes, Heidegger makes this move in his career. In the early days, he embraces Nazism as a kind of primitive spiritual, ethos of the German spirit, um, and he does that partly because he's thinking of, I mean, he really is right in the sense that human beings are relational. And so he's like, we need to get into the kind of forest and be relational with each other. And he initially he thought of the Nazis as kind of like embracing that, the great ethos of the agrarian, Black Forest farmers and so on.
I
Yeah.
Uh,
think the Hindus did too. Like I think like Gandhi and people like that did too.
sure, yeah. And then, of course, it's in the mid to late 30s where Heidegger's like, oh no, the Nazis are basically just embracing the machine. He begins to distance himself from that. And then he goes, the rest of his career, he's kind of like, well, almost kind of anti-modernist in a sense. He's very, very anti-technological. He's the one that introduces the term enframings or Gestell in the German, which is a way of like describing the overarching encroachments of technology as a kind of regimentation of modern life and dictating our very conditions of being in the environment.
Do you think
Uh,
that was anti-communist?
Undoubtedly, but anti any sort of big system that
Yep.
that would create infrastructures of
That was the
technological
system,
being.
wasn't it?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, he was even against like the typewriter because like the typewriter is removing the hand
But
from
that
the.
that's like our world. That's like people are like making those arguments like
Yeah.
a lot.
That's
Yeah,
like, yeah,
yeah,
that's where our on our spectrum.
I'm well aware of people being against. We had a guy that's against cars this past weekend.
sure,
Yeah.
sure. And I think what Heidegger ends up arguing for, which is the part that I think is problematic, um, both on the right and the left, which is that he ends up basically saying we need that authenticity is the sort of real source of primal releasing. That I mean, Gelassenheit is like essentially a term that means releasement, right? It's sort of releasing oneself into the relational beings that we are, but that if we can do this in this kind of forest setting with agrarian, people that work the land, then that's the kind of like relational being that he will privilege. And so he kind of like just retreats up to his cabin in the Black Forest and is just sort of anti-modernist in a way. But to my mind, I think he actually betrays the more fundamental insight in his both early and late work, which is that we are technological beings, human beings, unlike all the other animals in the animal kingdom. We rely on, fire and
Yeah.
on tools and on things to just exist. And communities that are, we're not entirely unique in that sense, but we are wholly relational beings. And I think for me, the answer, if there is an answer, it's not so much in retreating from technology and not even so much in sort of like looking for a culture that got it right, but it's just sort of engaging in a kind of aesthetic infrastructural war with the powers that currently dictate the kinds of extended thinking we can do with our devices, right? The problem that the reason it gets so hard to focus is that you have no control over the massive amounts of data that are just sort of thrown
Right.
at you constantly. And which is why it becomes difficult to read a novel now as opposed to just, flicking through TikTok or something.
Well, to be fair, I read novels literally every day, and I've solved that problem by all I got to do is make sure this thing is hidden. Where if I put it
Put it
under
somewhere else.
something
Put
and
the
I
phone
can't
somewhere
see
else.
it, yeah, like under a pillow, I can sit here and read all day. And my
Yeah,
students, I'm a high school teacher. My students can, there's this idea that kids don't have any attention span. They can sit there and focus on a video game for 3 hours straight.
absolutely.
The
Absolutely.
attention span is there. I
Yeah.
think that one of the things is this thing is providing competitors that are just frankly superior in the experience of many people to the novel. I like the novel. I like, but I don't want to be an elitist about this and kind of lord it over people who'd rather play racing video games or hunting video games or whatever,
Totally.
and it's just like but it's the thing is it's providing so many different things that are out competing
Mm,
everything else. And it feel, I don't want to feel like a reactionary where I'm fighting, what must happen, but
mm.
it's like kind of breaking your heart that it's like, oh my God, this thing is just never gonna
Yeah.
stop.
Well, and I'll just make one little comment too. Or actually, you know what, John, you go ahead, your response, and then I have one little
Well, I
question.
was just going to say, I really like that comment because I feel like one of my most heartfelt beliefs is that all thinking is thinking of and thinking with. And so that when you're using your phone, you're using it in a way that you're exteriorizing your memories into it and your engagement with the world. But that is a kind of thinking that's happening. Thinking isn't just something that happens only in the brain. It's a kind of extended
But
process.
do you think with video games, this kind of, don't you think there's a bit more of like a passive consumption of videos and video games as opposed to the transactional nature of reading? Like where you bring your whole mental model to this text, and I
I
don't know.
mean, someone could argue the exact opposite, actually, that you're more engaged when you're a participant
You're right, yeah.
in the conditions of like driving the where you go in in the world of the video game or something, right? I agree. Like I read novels all the time, but yeah, I recognize it as like kind of like a dying medium.
We call it a conservatory form now. It's like classical music or jazz or
Yeah, yeah, but it's a form of thinking that I think still has a lot of value. But in the larger sort of political fight, I'm not going to sort of like hold to the novel as like the
no,
answer
yeah.
to this dilemma, or or even poetry, whatever. For me, it has to do with and the reason it's so compelling is because I think we are from the beginning extended beings. We have to sort of begin to think of ourselves as not just these cells that can sort of like detach, but like attachments are who we are. Attachments are what make us human beings.
Mm,
And so in some ways, I think it's the fight is to get control over the things we're attached to
Yeah.
as collectively and
mm,
have greater understanding of yeah, because the problem with the systemic quality of these digital technologies is that they become infrastructural, and when they become infrastructural, they're invisible, right? Infrastructures are invisible to us when they work. If the highway works, there's no cracks in it. You're just cruising along, and you're not thinking about it as a highway. It's when it breaks down that it becomes this like, it's like highwayness shows itself to you.
mm,
And so I think that's the dilemma we're with right now is that it's become so systemic that it's hard to even recognize that we are extending ourselves into these
mm.
so
Okay,
invisible.
I have a couple of comments. One was Travis had brought up this point of discussion at the meeting, and it was basically like, did the machine come from Christianity? Like, are we stuck here? Is this like, is this a deterministic outcome? And people were kind of like, yeah, it did. And then they were like, it came from Catholicism breaking off from the East first, and then it got even worse with the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. And then, Paul Kingsnorth is like, the solution is in the East. It's in Eastern Orthodoxy. And I was just like, oh, like we're just done. We're just done for, I guess, unless all of us become either like Buddhist or Eastern Orthodox. And so I was like, okay, there's got to be a better, approach here that doesn't mean like abandoning our entire like heritage and
Exactly.
lineage. And what you were just saying makes sense to me. And I was thinking about this as also in terms of part of also what frustrates me a little bit about some of the things I advocate for too, because it's so hard to wrap your head up about around how to change things infrastructurally. That I'm like, just go to your homestead, just make your discernment on your family level, just pray, and then it's almost like neoliberal in a way to sort of individualize a collectivist problem, and so I think part of it is like a lot of us are just so hands in the air about how this could be changed on any other scale besides like our individual family, maybe even community associate with other people who have your same aesthetic considerations, but not much beyond that scale. So I don't know if you're thinking at all politically or organizing wise, just how to handle this in a collective way. But I'm very much like going in this direction on this path where it's not just like it's not just first of all, it's not going to the east, not for me anyways. And it's
Yeah.
not just praying, and it's not just controlling my own kids' screen time. there's something more than that, and it's within our own culture and within our own like canon. And there's lots of examples of people like having a discerning, relationship with technology, and attaching to technologies that are for flourishing, and kind of cutting out ones that are not. So what's the answer?
Yeah, so start the revolution.
Yeah.
No, I think that's really smart. I really like that that sense that that it's hard to say, oh, well, there's this answer, right? We live in a time when there's a massive loss of faith in the sort of meta narratives that would position us in our worlds and make us feel comfortable. So it's difficult because we know that there are these massive infrastructural systemic problems, and yet at an individual level, it's hard to imagine like what we can do. And so we end up, as you said, throwing up our hands or retreating. Um, and I don't think there's anything wrong with like retreating and sort of actually like recovering from the stresses and the anxieties that we experience day to day. I think the dilemma is if we think that that's the solution, when in fact it's just a way of sort of recuperating temporarily and then heading back out into the fight.
Yeah.
Right? Like, yeah, everyone needs to breathe. Everyone does need to sort of like have contemplative moments. But the problem is when that is framed as the solution to the problem as opposed to a sort of moment of repair
Mm.
and then back into it.
Mm.
Well,
Travis?
what's up? Want me to ask another question?
Yeah, but why don't we ask some wrapping up?
Sure, yeah, wrap up. Okay, so hold on. There was something important in the end here. Let me just check this. Um, okay, I guess this last question, the big block number 5, which says the spiritual quality of global capitalism is another really powerful kind of fragment. And whatever, I think you've argued kind of convincingly that Techne-Zen, this kind of Buddhist, machine, this melding of Buddhist spirituality and machine is what's going on in California and Silicon Valley, et cetera. Um, you know, do you think that there's like I think frankly this is the question. I'm just some high school teacher, but I think this is the question of like the future of humanity. It's the appropriate balance and equilibrium between quality and quantity, or between classic and romantic, or between whatever Zen and machine.
Mm.
Do you think, I just wonder if you've thought about, and this is a huge question to ask, but it is the question. Do you see any other kind of, synchronicities or any other kind of ways forward where the equilibrium is not, and I'm not kind of trashing Buddhism here, um, but I do think there is a bit of a passivity that can be associated with it as a spiritual discipline. And part of me feels like the spiritual element is expected to be non dominant, and the machine element is expected to be dominant. And I frankly would prefer a reversal of those roles. And I just wonder if you've considered other orientations, and if not, that's understandable too.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to sort of subscribe to any sort of spiritual or religious tradition that, coming from,
Yeah, I get you. Yeah, I'm not.
I mean, I had a very sort of reactive, almost sort of religious refugee sense of
Mm.
myself in my
I
late
get it. Yeah.
20s. Um, but it does not mean that I don't recognize the power of it as a collective mythos for organizing us. And if I felt like that there was a a a I guess in some ways I would be okay with being religious but not spiritual, as opposed to the other way around. But
Compt.
yes, yes.
I think that's his thesis, kind of.
Right. I mean, that I agree with that. That there's something valuable in ritual, there's something valuable in texts that help to create collective understandings. I think there's something valuable in having canons of works, whether they're literary or
By the way, you can replace religion with whatever psychoanalytic theory, with Marxism. I don't
yeah.
care. Is
Or
there
even like a yeah, canon literature. I mean, a
yeah
canon that where you have like some
other
sort of guidance,
yeah
a way of thinking about hard problems of life. Yeah.
Yeah, or even just sort of catalysts for allowing us to think collectively in new ways together, right? I think that to me, it's all about trying to capitalize, if you will, on the relational reality of our being. And that means, and that's, I mean, to me, I find it so much more therapeutic and powerful when I'm with a group of people and we've all read the same text and we're discussing it together. And there's a kind of a thinking with that's happening, as opposed to like when I'm, exhausted and I'm just like retreating to kind of recover from the stresses of my life. Like that's necessary. Naps are great. Like I'm not against.
no I get you no I know
Yeah, of course. But those moments of collective understanding are the most powerful things that I think can happen. And so those can happen within religious organizations, they can happen within political organizations. And I think probably right now where we are is in the world,
politics is religion yeah absolutely
politics is really the most important realm where we can engage these efforts at collective understanding. I mean, the last election is proof that we didn't, you know.
where are like the political traditions getting their where are they getting their authority?
Yeah, I
So
mean, even like their authority. I mean, I'm even thinking like the split that I keep seeing in the Trump administration between these like Elon Musk teal, let's go to the stars, hyper technology versus like RFK, Massey, Vance, maybe potentially Vance, I'm not
Mhm.
sure.
Think
Uh, like regenerative agriculture, healthy living, and more embodied, anti-pharmaceutical, whatever. Like I don't know, they like have two totally different senses of authority and vision and goals.
I mean, in some ways, I'm a traditional American liberalist in the sense that I think that the idea that we are a country of laws as opposed, we're ruled
yeah
by laws as opposed to, men is a good idea to still adhere to, that the Constitution is a kind of grounding document that's,
Here's my question though. Do you believe in this
yeah.
last election that because more people voted for Trump than for Kamala, that there's like authority behind that? Like
Mm,
you know what I mean?
Well, I mean, my understanding it has to do with collectivity again. I think if the Republican platform came out and just laid bare their economic plans, which are to privatize
Yeah, I
Social
agree.
Security and take away health care and give tax breaks to the billionaires, like no one would vote for them.
I
So and Bernie's been really good at sort of articulating this. So what they do is they introduce divisions and distinctions between
mm,
people. They say, oh, well, there's us and them, and there's the religious and the non-religious, there's the immigrants and the natives,
mm,
there's transgender and heterosexuals, there's men and women, there's all of these divisions that they can kind of sort of accentuate as a way of breaking up the population and achieving their political goals. And I think one of the problems that the left has had is that on the march toward a very virtuous and healthy embrace of diversity, we began to embrace difference, the distinctions between us, as the thing that stands in for political power,
mm.
as opposed to the collective sense of we're all in this together, we're all Americans. So I think in some ways, even though like, hey, I voted for Hillary, I voted for Kamala, like I embrace diversity and even identity politics to an extent. I think that the problem is that by portraying the left as a sort of like we are here because we are individual uniqueness in our race and our gender and our class, and like we've sort of left some sort of collectivity chips on the table as
Yeah.
it.
As like we're all in this together, we're all Americans, we all believe in the
Exactly,
rule of law, we
exactly.
all believe in the
So,
Constitution. Yeah.
and I think that the conservative efforts in America to sort of both capitalize on those divisions, us, them, trans, they, them, you, and so on, and to, be a populist like Trump, who's basically reproducing the message that Bernie would in some of his
Yep.
rhetoric. He's basically
Yep.
saying, "I'm for the common man.
Yep.
I'm going to give you of the jobs that you've lost."
Yep.
And in some ways, that was just the perfect recipe for overcoming
But
the left.
so I agree with your analysis here, just mostly. But my question is, you know, do you believe the American right is engaging in these kind of tactics, which I agree with your analysis of them, but because they simply like to divide people, or because the nature of the system requires that they mobilize a base through mass media politics, and the most effective way of doing that is through this kind of racialist appeals and othering of people, which are frankly effective,
Yeah.
and in my view then calls into question the system that is incentivizing this kind of rhetoric.
Mm.
Yeah, I don't actually think they believe that everyone's different in this sense. They bring out the transgender issue because they know
It's
it will
effective.
It's
strategically
divisive, yeah.
divide.
But
Yes,
so, but
divisive.
doesn't that kind of put a wrinkle in the idea of collect? I think what you're saying is a kind of democratic, small d, not Democratic Party, but a kind of
Yeah.
democratic antidote. But doesn't it seem that like they're kind of obvious? There's an obvious problem
Well,
with
I
it.
wonder whether or not this is something we talk about on our podcast a lot, and something we were just going to kind of turn our podcast toward, which was using politics at an appropriate scale. And it almost is now, like, I mean, even
The
harkening
mass
back to
scale is the same thing.
what you were saying, John, like with Heidegger, just anti-communist, but it was actually just anti, like, this whole machine, this whole industrial machine. Like the scale of politics now with mass media is just impossible. I mean, it's almost like unsurmountable or insurmountable, like, messaging to work on specific projects. But instead, I like this idea of subsidiarity, where it's like you're answering certain problems at the scale that's appropriate, the lowest possible scale that's appropriate to answer that problem. Is it a watershed problem? Is it a county problem? Is it something the mayor should be handling? Is it a state, versus federal? So I don't know. Your thoughts, John?
No, that seems right. I agree with that. I think you've got to organize it at every at every level. It's not going to be easy to solve the problems that we've kind of gotten ourselves into, both in
Yep.
terms of politically and the climate.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean
Yep.
it's like
Well, in the name of time, and also in the name of having moments together of collective epiphany, I would like to invite you, John, to our next gathering,
Oh, I'd
which
love
will
to.
be
I'd love
in
to come.
Wyoming in June, at this little place called the Wagon Box. I think you would really enjoy it. And it's kind of like the whole idea here is people who are engaging with these kinds of questions, but it's like a very tolerant, pluralistic kind of space where people can air out these different arguments and see, you
Great.
know, see if they can exchange ideas. And at least I don't know if you agree, Travis, but I was just like so overwhelmed by the
it's
experience of
unbelievable.
our
It's awesome.
weekend together. Just a real collective, like, wow, we're all wrestling with these really hard problems, and everybody's kind of, respectful and tolerant of each other. And we also do fun things, like we sing, we have an open mic, and we have
Sounds like
Nice.
band.
yeah, we had a
Great.
potluck, and we had mini debates, which are really fun because everybody is allowed to be like a little bit crazy. That one of the debates was like, you shouldn't wear anything but natural fibers. And then another person was like pro polyester, so stuff like that, which is just fun. One was anti-internal combustion engine by our friend Annie Hickman, who also hitchhikes all the time. So then we got him on that because it was like, well, if you're anti-engine, then how are you getting picked up?
Yeah.
John, thank you so much for coming on. This was such an amazing conversation. Travis, thanks for suggesting it and leading it. Any
Thank you
last
for having me.
comments or thoughts?
No, I
Well,
just really appreciate the generosity and the conversation. It's really refreshing.
yeah.
Cool.
And you have a book coming out. Maybe want to plug like what are your world futures thing?
Oh, that's another book. That's on the future horizon, as it were. Yeah, there's the two books. One is Out of Mind, which is the one I've been describing today, and then another book on world futures, late next year probably. So,
Great. All right, we'll follow back up with you, and thanks guys. Great
all
talking to
right,
you.
good talking to you guys.
Okay, bye.